Welcome to The Business of Travel, the official podcast of the Global Business Travel Association. I'm Rosemary Maloney, Vice President of the GBTA Board of Directors, as well as Senior Director of Corporate Travel at Freeman. In today's podcast episode, we're diving into one of the most critical aspects of business travel. It's policy. Travel policies are more than just a set of guidelines. They define how employees travel, how companies manage costs, and how organizations adapt to an ever-changing business environment. With shifting workforce dynamics, new expectations around flexibility, and ongoing efforts to balance cost control with traveler satisfaction, policies are evolving faster than ever. It is my pleasure to be moderating today's discussion to explore the current state of travel policies and what might be next for companies, suppliers, employees, travelers alike. I'm honored today to be joined by industry experts and my fellow GBTA board members. Carlos Almendros, Director, Strategic Sourcing, Travel, Card, and Marketing Manager at Cisco Systems. Carol Fergus, Director, Corporate Travel Events and Ground Transportation at Fidelity International. And Katie Virtue, Head of Sales and Marketing at Festive Road. Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for joining today's discussion. We'll get started today by going to the heart of the travel policy management for many, the always essential but challenging need to balance cost with employee experience. Corporate travel policies often aim to control costs while ensuring a positive experience for employees. How have companies and their travel managers adjusted their policies in recent years to strike the right balance between financial oversight and traveler satisfaction? Carlos, can we get started with what your view is on this?
Absolutely, Rosemary, and a great question, really, one that I think many of us buyers face day in, day out. I know when I speak to my peers, this is something that we've been addressing probably since we came out of the pandemic. Managing costs is a fundamental role of the travel buyer, and that's what we're all seeing as saving costs, driving the spend down, et cetera. But that's changed, and that's changed sort of over the last number of years, where well-being has become really, really pivotal, along with sustainability. These have become just as equally important. So, firstly, I kind of call out the collaboration that what I think I'm seeing myself and buyers alike is really working closely with our stakeholders in HR and ESG, those teams, to really ensure first and foremost that we have alignment. Because yes, whether you sit in finance, which is where I sit, or you sit in HR or other areas of the business, I think alignment is critical, is that we're really focused on, yes, driving the cost down, but also the well-being of our workforce, which is always going to be pivotal in my eyes. So just a few areas that I've seen policies evolve to try and address some of this is we've seen, policies allowing employees to add that personal additional time at the end of their business trips. That fits nicely into the well-being. I think it was on a recent podcast talked about how the business trip has the duration of a business trip has kind of grown. It's no longer as short as it used to be. And that's really because our workforce are looking to add that extra bit of time to, have some downtime after the business trip. Including technology, Rosemary, has always been part of our policies. And I think that continues to help improve work-life balance, using technology as well as conducting business travel. Advanced planning, that I think is just something that we and many of my peers continue to see. You book nice and early, you drive costs down. So there's the element of the financial part of it. And lastly, I'm going to just raise approvals, because I think culturally, every company is different. And so some companies may look at approvals being a way of driving that compliance and driving, improvements into your policy. But culture is going to dictate whether that's something you need to bring in or something that will be excluded. Again, cultural, you'll hear me talk a lot about that during the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol, how about you?
I agree with everything that Carlos has said. I would also add that we tend to look at risk and safety as well. So, making sure that people are making the right decisions and are linked to our security world, so that we can track and trace. In terms of policy and keeping people in that lane of compliance, we would talk about their risk and safety and how we need to know where they are and that they are using the companies that are preferred and have been vetted and tried and tested. So that's another thing that we would use. The other thing is when we think about technology, you know, the real piece around taking your people on a journey and really optimizing on the technology. So having that messaging that allows them to really understand what the policy is. And as they're making those bookings, you're getting those pop-ups and that messaging that reminds them of what the policy is, so they feel part of what's going on. I think communication is really, really important as well. So making sure that your policy is, you know, is very sort of clear, it's not too complex, and it's easy for them to understand, well, this is what I can do for that, this is what I can do for that, and also giving the approvers the guidelines and the support that they need, so that they are approving effectively, and really understanding what it is that we're trying to achieve around our travel policy in terms of traveler well-being, sustainability, and managing our costs. And, you know, just looking at, you know, little things like travel less, stay longer. So giving those little anecdotes that they think, okay, I get that, I know what that means. So I think communication, the safety, the use of data, so taking the emotions out of it, and really sort of taking your travel community on a journey will support and try and take away some of that friction.
Katie, what is your view on this?
So I'll maybe bring it up a level from where Carlos and Carol went, because they both talked about well-being, sustainability, risk and safety. And so I think something we've seen more so in the last few years is companies stepping back and looking at their strategy, because so much had changed throughout the pandemic and as travel came back. So they thought, great time to look at strategy. And with all that continues to change and disrupt in the travel world, and because they're looking at that strategy, that then becomes a guide for what then needs to change in the policy. And when we see companies changing or looking at or setting their strategy, they always put priorities under 3 areas: customer, cost, and care. Now, you might use different words. You know, care can be well-being and sustainability. You might use savings, but they always fall under those 3 buckets. And different companies have different weightings across those buckets. And therefore, how you then adapt your policy will depend on what you weight there, whether it's more on the cost side, the care side, or the customer side. And part of that exercise, we've seen a lot more buyers listening to their travelers. So conducting surveys or having you know, their top travelers come in as a group and have discussions and forums. Carlos mentioned, you know, stakeholder alignment. It's understanding what do they view as a great experience, because there might be assumptions, and it might be an assumption that it's going to cost a lot of money and that you're going to have to make these changes in policy, but actually maybe there's things that they value that won't be a lot of cost and that you could improve in the experience. So by doing that listening, we've seen more companies then be able to adjust their policy appropriately. And then the last thing I'll just add, you know, Carol mentioned the journey, and we've kind of seen that extension of looking at the trip. So all the way from planning and booking to then preparing for your trip when you're taking it, and then when you're returning, which is not just your expense, but as mentioned, you know, could be just your downtime and recovery from a trip. But what's the policy look like throughout all of those stages of the journey?
Oh, and that's great. Thanks, Katie, for bringing that up. I know at Freeman, I have a travel advisory council that's made up of people who raised their hands within my first month of being like, yeah, I want to contribute and provide help on this. And it's really interesting because the first survey I did, I got about 60 responses. And then when I did a flash survey, really just through that group where they could forward to different people in the organization, we had almost 400 people respond on like 2 very quick policy questions. And like accessing a group like that is a way that I think travel managers don't always take advantage of, but having people who raise their hand and say, yeah, I want to help you make things better, is a great way to go about that. Moving on to our next question. When it comes to travel policy, there is an ongoing challenge of compliance management versus flexibility. While many companies mandate booking through managed channels, enforcement is often inconsistent. What factors influence how strictly companies can enforce these policies, and what best practices have emerged for driving compliance without creating friction? Carol, why don't we get started with you this time?
As I said at the beginning, it's about clarity, so making it clear. And Carlos also mentioned about aligning with the stakeholders. I think it's really, really important that we have those conversations with the stakeholders and almost offer them a menu of suggestions. So if you do this, this will happen. If you do that, this will happen. And get them to buy in and empower them to be part of that journey in terms of looking at your data, what that data looks for the company as a whole, but slice and dice and really drill down to their particular business areas, and then say, okay, we don't want to have policies that are different for each of the business areas, but by and large, this is what we want to do. And then these are the key changes that we should be making, and get the stakeholders, especially at top level, to buy into those suggestions, feel part of the decisions that are being made, and then put that out there and drive it. If everyone's engaged and empowered, it makes it a lot easier to get the compliance. We have quite high compliance. And as you were saying, having those, we call them champions. So champions within the business areas that will take that intel out, will do the lobbying for you, will get that, be the sounding board for changes and get the feedback, so that when you're actually driving it, you've already got a lot of them on board. And, you know, there will always be winners and losers. There will always be people that go, I don't like this. This is not right. I want to do this. I want to do things differently. But I think that if you have the senior leadership on side and they are part of the messaging, invariably your compliance level will stay at where it needs to be, because people will think, I don't like it, but I get it, because the messaging has been right, they've been part of the discussion, and they know that the decisions are coming from top down.
Yes. Katie, how about you?
So when we start to think about the compliance piece, versus flexibility, when we're looking at policies with clients, there's 4 areas we look at. What's the content in terms of the different categories in your policy? Do you have certain things covered? Is it comprehensive? What's the culture of your organization? And is there clarity, just like Carol had mentioned? Because all of those, 4 things kind of come together to make it a great policy. And one of the guiding pieces of those 4 is really the culture. And, how does your company view decision-making with your travelers? Do you have more of a strict policy that's mandated? Do you do things like have lists of who is not following or complying with the policy and share that out? Or do you go more the other route where, we have one client who messages the budget holders of the travelers that they should talk to, versus an open public, kind of list of travelers that aren't complying. And then you have, I think the piece that is coming more into a travel manager's world of communications. So Carol mentioned that, and some are getting really creative. I kind of use the term, you have to sell the policy, not tell anymore. So do you have branding for your policy, your program? Are you using content like videos? Do you have internal support for maybe communications or marketing? Or use tools that now, you can throw a policy into a tool and it'll create some video for you. So we're starting to see some more of that, again, depending on the culture, maybe where you have a younger workforce or travelers who normally engage with that type of content elsewhere in your organization. So that's another consideration. How else, do other policies get communicated, and can that help with the compliance effort? And then I think the other piece is, can you embed policy into the tools and the processes to help get compliance? And what I mean by that is, does the policy show up in the booking tool, in an app you have for when you're traveling, with certain messages or pop-ups? And by doing that, you're delivering the information at the time the traveler needs it, rather than here's a document or PDF on a certain site that they view when they're onboarded. And so I've seen that help with compliance because they're getting it at that right time and with the right message of why they need to follow that specific policy.
Great, thank you. Carlos, how about you? Wrap us up on this question.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, it's a really good question. And I think Katie touched on something that you'll see a theme in what I talk about, because every company is different. And I think that company culture is definitely one of the factors that plays in how you can influence how strict a company enforces a policy or not. I speak to my peers on a regular basis, and they're all very different in terms of how strict and how you drive that. But that I would say is an important part and one of the factors that drives how strict you can be within your company and the culture that you're in. What I'd also say is that it's really important to note that a policy is not a guideline. Really, really important, because if you're just giving people, information and asking them to follow it or maybe not, then that's more to me a guideline. Whereas a policy, you really want them to adhere to specific, areas that you feel are important to the program, to the company, to your culture. And I think I call that out because that's where I've seen over time policies be just endless. Lots and lots of pages, a lot of information. And I'm going to state this because does your workforce read all of that information that's out there? That's the reality. There's so much to read. They're not reading half of that. And that sounds harsh, but we're in an environment where people just want answers. So they ask questions, they get what they need. So these policies that are long-winded and multiple pages really don't necessarily serve a purpose in our environment, and definitely today. Not every company uses the word mandate. I think, again, I reference back to the culture, because I think when you're managing compliance, you'll have a policy and you really get sort of overwhelmed with trying to drive greater compliance, and your culture, your company is just not using that mandate sort of style. It makes it challenging. So you've got to also take that factor into when you think about compliance and how you bring that into your environment. So in terms of best practices, I think I've heard again this through the previous question, but communication is always going to be key. Ensuring your workforce is clear on what those policy parameters are. How do we do that in a simple way so that it could be understood? And I think Katie touched on this, which is the policy is one area, but the integration of those parameters and those rules within your booking experience and booking process is where it needs to live. That's how it needs to be built into your programs. And that's where I think it's most successful, because that way your workforce and those employees that are conducting business travel are getting the information as they're booking that business trip. They're being prompted with areas that they need to stay within policy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that communication is really key, and it doesn't have to be, mass mailing. It can be short videos. It can be, SharePoint sites if you have them. But more importantly, as most of us use technology to book our business trips, I think that's a really key area to utilize the capabilities of your tools that you have out there. Data. We talk about data, and we'll continue to talk about data is key. Again, if you're not showing any of this data, why are we really even having it in our policies? Why have we got those controls? So I think it's important to look at how you're presenting that data to your leaders, to the business, so that they can understand how those data points drive improvements into the program, but also at times drive cost efficiencies, which enable business units to conduct more business travel, for example. So I think data will always be key. I'd also just add that we're always going to find or feel some friction, to have no friction when employees, when they do their consumer-like travel, there's nobody there telling them how, when, what, where. they go away. And so that is often what they may be comparing their business travel experience like. So I don't think we want to move away from friction, but I think we can ease that and make it easier by improving that communication, by bringing it into the technology. And then lastly, I would just add, one of the things that I'm seeing, not just in my environment, but across some of my peers, is how do we start to leverage, agent bots to be able to provide that information, that education to our workers so that they are constantly being educated as they're conducting their business travel. Okay.
Great, thank you. Moving from, our wider policy discussion to really specifically our policies around air travel, areas around business class eligibility, airfare booking window policies, and add-on charge reimbursements have evolved significantly. What trends are shaping air policies today, and how do they reflect changing business priorities or traveler expectations? I'll start off with this one because I'm in the process of looking at our data to see what our air policy can be, especially as we continue to grow both domestically and internationally. But I'd love to hear how you guys are all doing with your organizations. And Carlos, we'll start with you this time.
Okay, yeah. So here is an area which has evolved. And again, I go back to the pandemic that we all experienced, where we came out of that and the world was just a different place. So when it came to air policies and starting to look at, what could we do differently? I think not only myself, but many of my peers out there looked at the ways that they could align, a more well-being sort of policy that would work within their culture, within their environment. And so, leveraging data, doing a lot of analysis on, what we talked about earlier, balancing costs with well-being. So I think with the air side of it, our air travel policies, we've looked and continue to look at, how we bring in some of the medium cabins like premium into our policies. I think where it becomes a little bit more complex is that we're now seeing new retailing models, improved content channels. These make it more complex into, what you're trying to bring into your policies. So it does require us buyers to ensure we can continue to educate our leaders, which is what I've been doing over a number of years to help them understand that the ecosystem that air used to live in, the old EDIFACT world is changed and changing around us. So that's bringing in more capabilities, more pricing models. So I think this is becoming very, very complex and will continue to shape the way that we corporations and buyers look at our air policies. But similar to the first question, we have learned to balance costs with experience that does not always bring the lowest price. Huge savings when you're enhancing the experience. So that's something just bringing into the question of, coming out of the pandemic, what can we do differently? How can we look at, our flight duration, especially those long haul flights? Can we bring in, an improved cabin that enables our employees to be fresher and raring to go when they end that journey? So that they're the sort of things that I'm seeing, not only myself, but other peers of mine bring into their program. So for many of us, we've been tasked to help our companies grow bottom line and revenues. That's really, really important. We've got to do that. And we know that business travel plays a pivotal part in helping companies grow, meet their customers, and as I said, drive those revenues. Just some trends and some areas that we look at when we look at our air policies, things like flying hours, that's kind of things that we've looked at in terms of, what is the right duration that qualifies our workforce to travel in premium? What's the duration that would qualify for business? And I think these are not uncommon questions across the buyer community. But again, I reference things like bundled fares, ancillary fares that are often not included. So we're looking at how we start to include those into the policy, because if an employee is conducting a business trip and the costs are associated to the business trip, so baggage, certain amenities that we feel would help with that experience, then it's figuring out how do we bring that in so that it's part of the the policy per se. But I'll pause there because I can go down a rat hole here, Rosemary, but hopefully that's given a little bit of sort of insight into what I see anyway.
Yeah,
Thanks.
great. Thank you. Carol, I know during our prep call, you had mentioned some different things around qualifying for those premium classes in your view.
Yeah, so like Carlos, after the pandemic, we looked at our policy, and prior to the pandemic, we had a premium economy class. So anything that was between 5 and up to 8 hours was in premium economy, and it was also daytime travel. So if you're traveling in the day, you took premium economy. If you're traveling at night, you're allowed business class. After the pandemic, for social distancing and people's well-being, and also people being anxious to fly, we took away the premium economy and we had business class. And then, as Carlos alluded to, that comes with a price tag, because you're now saying you can we're now looking at with the lens of sustainability, and the fact that we're saying you should use economy or premium economy instead of business class for sustainability, in order to support with reaching our targets, etc., etc. So, Carlos is absolutely right. It's ever changing and you can go down a rabbit hole. But I will go back to saying that with all policy, it's about keeping it as simple as you possibly can, and getting people to really buy in and understand what it is that, even as a buyer, understanding what is that culture and what is it that you want us to do, and are you going to live it? Because there's no point telling us. So, for example, there's no point saying that you have to make sustainable choices if the policy is saying it's cheapest on the day. What does that actually mean in reality? Is it the cheapest sustainable option, or is it still cheapest on the day? So quite rightly, Katie has said, what is your strategy? What is it that you're looking to do? And then you follow those lines and you follow the culture, and then you get the buy-in from everybody. So I have seen those peaks and troughs, but it changes as the world is changing. And as a buyer, we have to try and keep up with that, with what's happening externally, and align it to what we're trying to do internally.
Thank you. Katie.
So the, I guess, question I'll add to this, that both Carlos and Carol are touching on, and that I'm seeing buyers start to debate within their organization, is what is lowest logical fare. So many policies still state that, but the question has been, how do we actually define that? So as Carol mentioned, you have your strategy in place, and what does that mean then, though, when you get to defining that lowest logical fare? Because now you've got the consideration of, lowest logical emissions. You've got maybe issues with trying to access non-GDS content. So how does that all come into play when you're trying to tell your travelers to book the lowest logical fare? But now you have, all of these other considerations. So I think that's just one for companies to think about, and travel managers to define within their organization, and make sure it's clear.
Great. Thank you. Another significant consideration in travel policy evolution is factoring in aspects of how the workforce is changing. With more remote and hybrid employees, traditional corporate travel policies may not align with modern work arrangements. How are companies adapting policies to accommodate a more dispersed and flexible workforce? For global companies, has it always been like this? And Katie, are you seeing a parallel between changes in the workforce and the travel policy?
So I think we saw a lot of focus on this area coming out of the pandemic, as companies tried to figure out what their workforce strategy was going to be. In some cases, that might have quieted down for companies, as maybe they've settled on, if they've got remote, hybrid, or back in the office. There might be still, though, some companies who are having big changes, and therefore they need to consider what that means, not just for travel policy, but also for expense. And oftentimes there's a lot more collaboration with different types of stakeholders that travel needs to have, that need to be considered. And I know, Carlos will probably touch on that, and some of the stakeholders he's been working with. I think certainly what travel is able to do now is look back in the last maybe 1 or 2 years and see if there's been an impact to their travel patterns. So, as we were still coming out of the pandemic years, 21, 22, maybe even a bit of 23, it was hard to go by some of that data to know, do I really have different locations? But now those are probably a bit more solidified to know, okay, have people moved or shifted? Have we closed offices, changed those? And therefore, what does it mean when I go into negotiations with especially airlines, hotels, maybe a bit of ground? So I think there's still the awareness within travel to know what are our work from home policies, what are these work arrangements, and therefore what does that mean for travel? For example, if people work remote, what is travel even considered? If they, have to go to a work meeting locally, is that considered travel? Do they have to follow certain processes? And certain, expense policies as well. So that's what we're seeing right now.
Great, thank you. Carol, I think you had some notes on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think things have definitely changed in terms of the way people see travel. And, going back to what Katie was saying about the expense policy, and does people see, how do you define what is now considered travel? So office to office, there's discussions at the moment around, whether individuals should be they should be able to put expenses for going to an office that's not their contractual office, and how we manage that for the future. That was never a thought before, but now it is. When people leave their homes, they want that home to office, office to home environment. So it's just thinking about how we've grown our accommodations program. So looking at the accommodations and what's available, even when you go to your offices abroad, it's not all the time that the people that you're going to see, they'll be there for the meetings, but then other days they're working from home. So do you want the option of being able to work from home even though you're abroad, or do you want to go into the office every day? So it's just kind of changing mindset and making sure that individuals have that choice and they want that choice. Even some of the, looking at those people that travel, asking that question initially, do you actually want to travel? Having something that makes them think about the steps and the journey. Do I want to do that? And what does it mean to me? And if I am going to travel, what's my expectations? And as the buyer, I need to be asking those questions. What is it that people want, and what should we be offering them? And what conversations are we having with our suppliers to enable us to provide the services that our travelers want, and understand those differences? The whole piece around, DEI, traveler well-being, accessibility, that's at the forefront of many people's minds now. So we have to have those deeper conversations, and we need to have the conversations that enables both the visible and invisible disabilities to be apparent, so that we can do something about it. So conversations around that and how we do that, both within your own environment, but the wider travel industry. How do we support ourselves? And what's new? What are people doing? What are the best practices that we can share? And then again, I think, is it Carlos might have said about, combining the whole business and leisure? We're seeing a lot of that. People are saying, well, if I'm going to travel longer, our policy says, travel less, stay longer. Well, if you're going out to Asia, it kind of begs the question, should I add on a couple of days to do that? So it is a changing environment, and as with everything to do with the policy, we can't build a policy for everybody. But what we can do is what's really important and what can really be made, where we can really make a difference. That's where we should be collaborating together and building that kind of, as best as it can be, in class policy for your own culture and appetite. So that's my piece.
Lovely, thank you. Carlos.
Yeah, I think Katie and Cal touched on a lot of really good points, and we have a hybrid workforce. There's no surprises, or it's not hidden. We a lot of our technology enables companies to do this extremely well and in a secure, safe manner. People are working from so many different places. But when it comes back to the how companies are adapting their policies to accommodate a more dispersed and flexible workforce. Again, I think Kate touched on it a little bit here. In a lot of organizations, you've got different functions. And so when I look at this piece, and when we came out of the pandemic, we collaborated. We worked closely with key stakeholders from our HR teams, from mobility, and more importantly, from tax. Because that tax, that regulation, which differs in many, many countries, and if you get into Europe, there are definitely a few more challenges as you get into different countries that I think we have to be aware of. So you cannot really, confuse your travel policy with those policies. You need to partner really closely because there's experts in those areas, and that's what we did. We worked extremely closely and ensured that we were part of that conversation. We had a voice at the table. We were able to share the business travel community and help our stakeholders understand how that played into this part. So there was really a key for all of us to make sure there was no conflicts between the policies, because there are a number of policies, not just in our corporation, but in other corporations. So I think that was key, is to ensure that we were having those conversations, we were working closely. But again, everybody has seen people move into different locations, whether that's low-cost locations or wherever it may be. So employees made some decisions themselves to move into those locations. And so what we need to also factor in is we have a responsibility, a financial responsibility, to manage the program efficiently and effectively. And so when it comes to the remote worker, the hybrid worker, like many other companies, we've looked at things like commuting, we've looked at how they get to the airport and things like that. But again, we've not really amended or adapted or changed the travel policy to do anything different at this point. I think we just continually had those key stakeholder meetings, reviewing the program, reviewing each of the policies, and just making decisions as we go along the way. And I think even today, and I'm from the technology sector, we're not traveling anywhere near to the point we were pre-pandemic. So I think we're still trying to determine what that norm is. I think a lot of companies out there are trying to figure out, what is the norm? Some are already there, some haven't got there, some maybe a little bit behind. So I think if you think about this topic, and I listened to a podcast only this morning on the workforce, and I think it's going to continue to evolve. We're seeing conversations in the industry and in the workplace where some companies are asking employees to go back in. Is it a good thing for the new hires to be in an office collaborating as opposed to the older workers? So I think this topic will just continually evolve. But in terms of how we adapt our own policy, I think we just need to kind of make sure that we not necessarily stay in our lane, but make sure that we're collaborating with those other policy owners to ensure that we're providing input and feedback as we go along this journey. But this will evolve. This will continue to evolve. I think it's going to continually be a hybrid, but where and how people work will just evolve as more companies see the efficiencies it can bring. But it's just an ever-changing environment, Rosemary. Okay.
And speaking of those ever-changing environments, it's that whole question of, do you do a policy one? Some organizations take a one-size-fits-all approach, while others tailor policies based on employee seniority, trip purpose, or destination. Do you see a shift towards more personalized travel policies, and what challenges or benefits does this approach bring? Katie, why don't we start with you from a 35,000 foot view?
Yeah, so I think what we've seen is there's some organizations who they still have their policy that has some tiers, right, based on seniority. There's certain maybe types of industries or sectors where this is a bit more common to have that. I don't know that will quickly go away. But what I think more companies are doing when it comes to some of that personalization piece is look at data and start to understand, based on the data, where can we flex some things? And what we've encouraged companies to do and worked with some is to utilize some what if scenarios. So utilizing that data, what are potential customizations, points of personalization, things you would change, and utilizing the data and what if scenarios to say, so what's the outcome of this from a cost standpoint, from an emission standpoint? What would that change look like? We've seen some other companies try to be a bit more creative to say, okay, we're not going to change our policy in terms of, for example, covering airline lounge access. But we do have some soft dollars. We have, lounge passes in our agreement, and we are going to, find scenarios when we can apply those, maybe when someone has a significant delay. So they're still trying to be, focused on the employee experience without going towards creating personalized travel policies. So I would say it's the technology still maybe isn't there to also make it really easy to personalize policies. So let's have our consistent policy, but look at where we can use technology, data, information to improve the experience of travelers.
Great, thank you. Carol, I know you mentioned you use a lot of communication and pop-ups. Is that somewhere you could see this? Is this somewhere where you can see that also benefiting?
Yeah, but I think the messaging and the pop-ups are more about keeping the policy in mind of the traveler, and so they don't have to think about it. This is what I can do. This is what I can't do. It's very simple. And I would definitely say with the systems, it's about programming and not customizing. This is a policy, we program it so that it follows the rules. Everyone's on board, they know what they have to do, and it just keeps it very, very simple. Understanding some of the regions globally, I have a global program, but there will be some nuances that you have to adapt to because of the culture and the appetite. But I think by and large, your global policy should be what it says it is, a global policy where everyone follows the rules with some slight nuances based on the regions and the culture. So that's what I try to drive. Doesn't always work. And I think, in an ideal world, that's where we would need to be. But I think, as I said, have those pop-ups, make it clear what people can and can't do. They understand the rules. It's not complex. And then that you have your approval process in place for those exceptions where people want to deviate from those rules.
Great, thank you. Carlos, bring us home.
Yeah, so customize or not to customize. I mean, when you start with that, you think if you customize anything, you have to maintain it. And so I think you've really got to think about, customizing anything, because it just requires more effort, more work. And, we're stretched as it is. So that's just my first point. The second is, when you talk about a shift to a more personalized travel policy. So to give you an example, I wouldn't call it personalized, but I would say persona or even maybe rule-based, because, for example, in a global policy like ours, we have to have some different policies that are driven through where people are traveling to, especially high risk and extreme risk and then prohibited countries. So you have to have, and that's not personalized. That's really, again, based on your company, based on the culture. There are going to be places that you deem higher risk. There's going to be places you do not want your employees to go to. So I think, I wouldn't say a shift. I think we're going to see technology and the capabilities of technology allowing you within your corporation to become just smarter. You may have a business unit that wants to do something very different, but the technology needs to be flexible. It needs to be agile. It needs to adapt. And so I think those are the things that we're going to see in the future when it comes to, personalized travel policy. I would probably steer away from personalized, because it seems like you're doing something personal. But anyway, so yes and no. I think there's an element of this occurring. I believe, as I've just explained, we do see different policies that fit different purposes within a different culture as well. As I mentioned, customize or personalize. The challenge I see, and again, every company size, large, small, medium, depending on the size of your company, having separate policies, personalized or customized, you've got to think about how you're going to maintain those. Today, I've mentioned it a couple of times, getting employees to read one policy and start adding a few other policies, you already know you're going to have some challenges. So you got to keep it clear. To Carol's point, one global policy, but I think that there's always going to be some addendums per se, depending on your culture and your policy. I'd then touch on data. Data will continue to play an important part on these decisions. You're not going to start doing personalized policies unless the data is telling you that you need to do something different. And I can't stress the importance of using that, because when you have to go in front of your leadership and you have to explain to them that you want to bring in an extra 2 or 3 policies, you've got to back it with data. So that's kind of just how I've seen, talking to many peers over the years, that's what helps you get through these processes. And I think it'll have to be a very good business case to kind of start creating, multiple personalized policies. So let the data help you form the right policy for your company. I think that's something that I would take away. And I'll pause there for now. I was going to bring in, which I'll add it, but I think it was more around, we're going to see AI coming into this whole booking experience. And I think it's going to be exciting to see how that may play into personalizing or customizing travel policies in the future. I just think that's something that excites me in terms of how that can drive, especially in a big global company where you may find specific business functions really want to go down a different path, whether it's constraining the policy, whether it's making it more flexible. So again, I feel that technology, and it would have been amiss if I didn't mention it during this whole podcast. Okay.
Carlos, that actually leads us into the best part of, what everyone's final thoughts can be. I was going to ask you what your final thoughts are. So that's really helpful that you brought up AI and kind of those use of those tools to kind of change the policy. Katie and Carol, I'd love to hear what you guys think is what's coming next for our industry in this kind of realm.
Sure, I'll go first. I know we joked in our prep for this about only using 3 words in your final thought. So I have 3 words, and it is goodbye Word documents.
Oh, I like that. It'd be good.
Very good.
Carol, how about you? What are your final thoughts?
So I wrote a couple of things down. So I'll start from my bottom. So I think there'll always be the piece around inclusivity and that whole the whole traveler well-being, and taking that should become kind of the forefront on people's minds if we're talking about giving our travelers a seamless journey and really taking on board where they are today. Advancement in technology, so leaning on the whole AI piece, and looking at travel assistance, and looking at ways of taking away some of that grunt work and let the systems and automation take care of that. And I think we will really move towards that. And I think also we need to think about people. And the reason I say that is because when new ideas come and you start talking about use of technology, that's when you get the anxiety. What does that mean for me? Am I going to lose my job? So I think it's the whole piece around upskilling and making people feel that they have a place, and that although that the technology will be prevalent, that it's going to be a new and different way of working. So that's my thoughts.
Great, Carol. Thank you.
Rosemary, also, I know I mentioned, but I thought about this. Let your data guide you. Let your culture guide you. Do not create a policy that creates loopholes for your employees to spend time wasting time. That's my last comment.
Unfortunately, that's our time for today's podcast. A big thank you to Katie, Carlos, and Carol for sharing your unique insights today. The conversation in our industry will continue when it comes to travel policy evolution. And a big thank you to all for tuning in today. We hope you continue to share your thoughts and best practices with your fellow professionals throughout our industry. If you have any questions or comments for the GBTA Board of Directors, please reach out to us anytime via email. You've been listening to The Business of Travel, the official podcast of the Global Business Travel Association. For more information about GBTA and our work, please visit gbta.org and be sure to rate and review us wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening.